While the Defense Department says that the nuclear enterprise is the number one thing, their actions don't display that's the way it is.
If the United States were to get rid of its nuclear weapons, it would basically be subject to coercion by Russia, by China, because of the presence of nuclear weapons.
Some of the most recent ones are actually intellectually dishonest.
The people in Washington, D.C. don't actually understand national security in the way that they should.
They say, we don't need the missiles. We have enough nuclear weapons in other systems. We talked about this, that I think we make the mistake of thinking that other nations see things the same way we do. We have plenty of evidence that they don't. They don't look at the same thing.
Welcome back to the Generally Speaking show. Today we have Joe Scallorns. He's from Missouri, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Strategic Deterrent Coalition. But before we get started, I'd like, Joe, if you could, just introduce yourself to the Generally Speaking audience. Give us some of your background, how you got involved with Strategic Deterrent Coalition. I think they'd be interested to understand your role advising the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and how you came to do that. I think it's an interesting story, and I think it's a role that people aren't really aware of. So if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself to the audience.
All right. Well, thanks, Rob. I was a banker in Missouri for many years. And during the 90s, actually about the time that the B-2 came to Whiteman Air Force Base, I was a friend of Ike Skelton's, who was the longtime congressman and eventually became chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. And I was on a banking trip to D.C. having lunch with Ike in the Capitol dining room. And we were talking about various things in the state and within the district. And he said, are you involved in this support group over at Whiteman Air Force Base? And I said, well, no, I'm not. And he said, well, you should be. And he told me a bit about it. And I said, well, I'll consider it. I think that was on like a Thursday or Friday. About the middle of the next week, I got a call from some major at Whiteman that said, we understand that you want to get involved. And so Ike set me up for that. So I started by visiting with, we had a new commander at the time at the wing, and I thought I could be of some help to him in his relationships with the civilian community surrounding the base. So that's kind of how I got started. And after a couple of years, I was invited to serve on the Air Combat Command Commanders Group, it was called at the time. And it was a group of civic leaders from the various bases within Air Combat Command. And we met on a periodic basis, usually at Langley, but sometimes we would go on trips to see other parts of the Air Force and get a good understanding of what the command was doing. And then after a few years of that, General Keyes was the commander of Air Combat Command. And he recommended me for a new group that then Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Buzz Mosley, had organized. And it was the Air Force Chief of Staff Civic Leaders Group. And so in the second year of its existence, I went on that group. And that group is just like civic leaders at local bases. They become trusted friends and advisors to the commander. This is the best way I could describe it. And as his generals would give him their best military advice, his civic leaders would give him their best civilian advice. And that has continued, and I've served full terms on that group, and now continue to serve as an emeritus member, which means I don't go to all the events, but I do get invited to annual events and some trips with the Chief of Staff of the Air Force or the Vice Chief. So that's kind of how I got my involvement with as a civic leader for the Air Force. Well, as you know from your experience, the strategic deterrent, the nuclear enterprise, underwent some problems, and started with what was referred to as the Minot incident, where some nuclear weapons, though not armed, but nuclear weapons were in fact transported from one base, Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, without them realizing that nuclear weapons are on board, and of course proper protocols weren't followed. As it turned out, you know, the mistake was discovered and corrected, but it drew attention to the fact that we had become complacent within the nuclear enterprise in our national defense, and we let our guard down and did not uphold the high standards that we had set for ourselves within the enterprise. So as a result of that, Chief of Staff at that time, General Schwartz, created a staff position, Assistant Chief of Staff for Nuclear Deterrence and matters, the A-10, and they also put in motion to create a new command to get the nuclear enterprise out of Air Combat Command, where it had been put at the quote end of the Cold War, and created the Air Force Global Strike Command, which was then to become the Air Force element of U.S. Strategic Command. So I was fired by General Will Fraser as a civic leader of Air Combat Command because my base went to a new command, and Lieutenant General Frank Klotz was the first commander of Air Force Global Strike Command, and he asked me to serve on that civic leaders group, which I did and still do. So there's kind of the background of my involvement as an Air Force civic leader. This led to, I guess it was about, well, as the Air Force Global Strike Command started to develop, the civic leaders realized that we didn't really have a voice in public discourse about that element of our defense. You know, there are all sorts of organizations that support the fighter community. There are all sorts of organizations that support the logistics community. There was no one really standing up for the strategic deterrence or the nuclear part of it. It's kind of like at one of our symposium, the defense attaché from Denmark said in Denmark, they really appreciated the nuclear umbrella that the United States provided for them, and they understood the whole structure of strategic deterrence, but they just didn't want to talk about it. And I think that's kind of the way that we were during, well, for the last 15 years. Almost 30 years, we went without talking about it. And so now we were in a situation where we were talking about it, but nobody knew much what they were talking about. And as you know, it's very difficult to advocate for something that's complicated, and especially something that's complicated and a good deal of it's classified. So people have a tendency to either overcomplicate the discussion or oversimplify the discussion. And there were a few of us at that time that felt we need to have a voice of reason in the public discourse. About that time, we were hearing all sorts of things being published and said by Global Zero, an organization that is flatly against nuclear weapons of any kind. And they published a report which they implied was a government-sponsored report, which it wasn't, and implied that it was some sort of a scientific and based on solid information, which it wasn't. But they had the ability to secure a lot of endorsers, a lot of famous names who said, yeah, this makes sense. We can have a world without nuclear weapons. So here again, a group of us said, this is silly. Why can't we publicize the truth about what's going on here? Why can't we actively support and endorse a major element of our national defense? So a group of civic leaders, as I just described, got together, I believe, once in December of 2013. Then in the spring of 2014, we got together in DC and decided that we would create an organization. And then we went through the process of creating a not-for-profit 501c3 educational organization. And it was during that year that we got organized. We got our tax exempt status approved. And then we had I guess it was in May of 2014. Was it 14 or 15? It was May of 2015 that we had our very first symposium. And this is interesting because we had it in Warrensburg, Missouri, which you know, but most people don't know, is a pretty small town right adjacent to Whiteman Air Force Base in west central Missouri. So all my friends in Washington, D.C. and in New York said we could never do it. It would never happen. But we did succeed in having a national symposium in Warrensburg, Missouri in that year.
And I was happy to be one of the featured speakers at that symposium. And at the time, I was working with the Joint Staff for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, looking at U.S.-China competition. And the result of a lot of that work, I published in a book called Stealth War. Now, one of the key principles in that book is the idea that nuclear weapons have forced warfare into the public domain. Using the internet, using our companies, using our universities, our political system against us, the Chinese Communist Party has sought to undermine our society from within. And one of the main reasons is because the price, the cost to China and the United States of direct armed conflict is too high, precisely because of the existence of nuclear weapons. So the people you talk about, the Global Zero, don't acknowledge the fact that their plan requires the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, Russia, and China to get rid of their nuclear weapons, and other countries like North Korea and Iran, and well, Iran doesn't have, but India, Pakistan. And of course, we know that getting those authoritarian regimes to get rid of their nuclear weapons is going to be almost impossible. Moreover, if the United States were to get rid of its nuclear weapons, it would basically be subject to coercion by Russia, by China, because of the presence of nuclear weapons. So the nuclear enterprise is a key component to our national security and has driven competition underground in a way that Department of Defense hasn't really aligned itself, nor has the federal government or even the American people. Part of this equation, the existence of nuclear weapons, the need to protect the nation from direct armed conflict by countries like China or Russia, is something that Americans need to know about. And then they also need to know about that, because of the existence of nuclear weapons, that their schools, their political systems, their local politics, or state politics, or companies are all subject to essentially attack by the Chinese Communist Party because of that. So what I wanted to explore today is, what is going on in the nuclear enterprise? What are the challenges the nuclear enterprise faces? I understand, having lived this, that DoD is not focused on the nuclear mission as much as it used to be during the Cold War, but yet it maintains a pivotal part of our overall defense. So what are the challenges, and where do you see the Department of Defense meeting those challenges, and where do you see them where they still have work to do?
Well, I think that the greatest challenge is to have a truthful and robust discussion of the nuclear enterprise we're really talking about. Those folks who, I get it. If you wish there was a world without nuclear weapons, I do too.
And so do I.
Right.
We all do.
But you cannot unring that bell. So I also think arms control can be a good thing. But we have to, I think we have to go back to and really get off of these tangents that we go on, well, we can't afford so many $1 billion in this, and of course, this is something that really is irritating, is folks who make the affordability argument are this is not a budget discussion. It's a discussion of priorities. And while the Defense Department says that the nuclear enterprise is the number one thing, their actions don't display that that's the way it is. If they did, then we would proceed on these programs as we are, and understand that there is a need to try to make them as affordable as possible. But that does not mean that we alter the product. We alter the process so that we do not waste money in the process, but we still need the result. Now, for example, a year ago, we were talking, folks like you and me, we're talking about the fact that isn't it great that we have a nuclear posture review, a national defense strategy, and a national military strategy, all aligned in saying that nuclear weapons are a necessary focal point of our defense posture, and that we need to focus our attention on the primary competitors in that area, being Russia and China, as well as the often said lesser nuclear competitors, North Korea and Iran. We leave out of the discussion other nuclear capable nations, but because they are somewhat aligned with our point of view, we don't consider them major competitors. So I suppose, to get back to your question, what the major challenge is to keep from talking out of both sides of our mouths. We have people that publish articles all the time now. You see them almost daily that are knocking the nuclear enterprise one way or the other, and and I think that some of the most recent ones are actually intellectually dishonest in that first of all, they say we don't need them. We don't need the missiles. We have enough nuclear weapons in other systems. This goes back to, we talked about this at our very first symposium, if you'll recall, that I think we make the mistake of thinking that other nations, other folks, see things the same way we do, and they don't. We have plenty of evidence that they don't. They don't look at the same thing. Our allies don't look at things exactly the same way we do. And a good example is the North Korean situation. You know, Japan and South Korea are two of our closest allies, but that's not a threesome. They have different concerns and relationships with each other, with North Korea and with China. And it's very difficult to articulate the point that what is enough nuclear deterrence, because it's in the eye of the beholder. You know, it doesn't matter what Chairman Smith thinks. What matters is what Putin thinks, and it doesn't matter these writers. The thing that irritates me, and for the first time I've spoken out publicly about it, is they're not accountable to anyone. You know, they can say whatever they want to, but everyone we talk to are either accountable to their company, their employer, to the Department of Defense or the Department of Energy or the government. We're accountable for what we say. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but the biggest challenge is conveying the information accurately, in my opinion.
Well, but so, I mean, I agree that is a challenge, but there are some challenges that you alluded to with regard to budget priorities. And in particular, what I was getting at is the requirement that we have to modernize the nuclear enterprise, and the fact that these letters that you're referring to, letters to the editor, op-eds, what have you, and different communications, all have the singular goal of eliminating the budget for modernization of the nuclear enterprise. So given the fact that we're going to spend, you know, billions of dollars, I think it's over $1 trillion on the F-35 procurement, but F-35s don't keep the Chinese Communist Party at bay, don't keep the Russians at bay, don't keep the North Koreans at bay as much as nuclear weapons do. And so what we're talking about here is how the DoD spends its money, what it prioritizes. And today we know that these systems were built in the 50s and 60s. Now they've been maintained, but it's time to modernize. So can you just go through the key acquisition programs that need to get funded, and how, you know, the triad works together, almost collaboratively to create a deterrence that is meaningful to our adversaries?
Well, the biggest part of the problem, in my opinion, is that everything's been put off too long to the fact that now we have to deal with all three major systems at the same time. That is, the submarines have just they've been extended beyond their proposed useful life when they were created. So the Columbia class submarine is an absolute necessity to maintain that leg of the triad. And even folks who want to get rid of one leg of the triad or the other don't want to get rid of that one. So there's a priority that's staring us right in the face. Then we get to the bombers. I think that we are on target. As I understand the information that I've read, we're both on time and on budget with the B-21. And I think that the path looks fairly clear for that becoming a replacement for the B-52, which is, I guess, the newest ones we're flying now were built in the 60s. And then the...
Not 1960 and 61 to be precise.
Yeah, 1960, 1961. The B-1s, have been converted and are no longer nuclear capable. So while they're part of our bomber force and been used extensively in the Middle East, they're flying beyond their proposed useful lives, and they've been extended somewhat just so that we can maintain a force for conventional warfare. And of course, the one element that the bomber does within the nuclear enterprise is posturing. And the B-1 helps with that. Even though they're not nuclear capable, it's a big bomber that we can put anywhere in the world we want.
Can you just briefly tell people what posturing is, because they wouldn't understand that?
Well, this is to demonstrate to allies and potential adversaries our capability. And I think maybe the best way, we had for a while, as you know, a continuous bomber presence in the Indo-Pacific region, primarily rotating B-1s, B-52s, and B-2s to Guam. But that's been changed, and now we have a concept called Bomber Task Force. And this is a little different. This way, we just put a bomber anywhere in the world we want to, whenever we want to. And if we want to...
And so our adversaries can see that with satellite photographs. And that's and we can also generate these aircraft on alert. And so if the president says we have a problem with something and he wants to demonstrate resolve, generating them on alert is something that can be observed by satellite, and our adversaries can know that we mean business. That's what you mean by posturing.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's it. And that is a unique capability that without firing a shot, you make a statement, and that's extremely helpful in international relationships to be able to do that. It's helpful to our allies to demonstrate that they can exercise with our bombers, as we recently did with some that went to Portugal and then went to the North Atlantic. We have bombers in Guam, and they can fly over Japan, and so yeah, that's exactly what we mean by posturing, and I think that's an important element of the bomber force, is to demonstrate its capability without risk. without risk of conflict, but just a show.
Right, and it's a way to use nuclear weapons as a sort of psychological weapon. It's not a kinetic weapon. It's a weapon that's used to impact the minds of the leaders of our adversaries to let them know that something is important to us.
It's to help them understand reality and to help them do the right thing. So then the third leg, of course, is the ground-based strategic deterrent. And wish to heck they would think of a name for that. I don't really care what it is, but
most people know that as ICBMs.
Yeah, okay. This is the replacement for the Minuteman. And, you know, they can call it Minuteman 4 or Minuteman 6 or Minuteman X or whatever they want to call it. It's just awfully hard for people to understand the acronym. But it's the replacement ICBM. And that too is going forward. It's not an upgrade, and it's not not a modernization of a system. It is a new system to replace the old one, and then that too is costly. The other thing, which I think is a challenge, Rob, and that is when we're talking about budget. You started this part of the conversation with that, is the skinny defense budget or the flat defense budget, which is another misnomer. There's no such thing as a skinny budget. Skinny budget implies, you know, you keep what you got and you don't expand. But what it really means is you have less to work with, because as you know, everything we do this year costs us more than it did 10 years ago. In fact, it cost us more than it did a year ago. And the inflation in our economy affects our defense cost. You know, as wages increase, the cost of everything we buy increases. And when you're talking about big programs with billions of dollars, well, then a relatively modest percentage increase can be several $billion. That, of course, is one of the other things that the naysayers, you know, they will utilize whichever is the most impactful, you know, but $30 billion more, you know, and what they leave off is for the next 30 years. You know, if
well, anybody would think $30 billion is a lot of money, but when it's in the context of a budget that is in the $700 to $800 billion range, then you get a picture of what we're talking about. And I think that's really the issue here, and that is, this is a vital element of our defense. It forces China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran to look for other ways to undermine our society, whether it be through cyber, whether it be through financial or economic means, whether it be through political subversion or influence through propaganda or social media. These are the ways that these countries choose to attack our system and our way of life. And they do that precisely because they fear direct military conflict because of the presence of nuclear weapons. So it's really about prioritizing defense, understanding in the 21st century how nations choose to go to war, particularly against a nuclear armed opponent, and recognizing that, you know, the way we've structured our priorities, the way we've structured, the protection of our homeland is not aligned with the way our adversaries are choosing to fight. Now, we found out in Iraq and Afghanistan that if you don't have nuclear weapons, it's pretty easy for the U.S. military to come in and do things. However, as we know with China and Russia and North Korea, that nuclear weapons changes the game, and it changes it in fundamental ways. And unfortunately, since the end of the Cold War, where we were focused on the nuclear enterprise and really focused on competition in preventing Soviet active measures from happening in our society, we were much more aligned with a different way of thinking about the military budget and priorities. And in particular, we focused on funding the nuclear enterprise and really use the discretionary spending in our budget to invest in science and technology, STEM education, infrastructure, things like the Eisenhower National Highway System, and manufacturing. So we were building the industrial capability of this nation while at the same time we were deterring direct nuclear conflict with our adversaries. We abandoned that at the end of the Cold War in anticipation that this disagreement between democracy and authoritarianism had been resolved, and everybody was going to play well together, and that became this embrace of China so that they would adopt our liberal democratic order. And of course, we know that they haven't done that. Not only have they not done that, both Russia and China have been investing in their nuclear enterprise. So what the Strategic Deterrent Coalition is attempting to do, and what I think is a noble effort, is to educate the American people on the fact that the people in Washington, D.C. don't actually understand national security in the way that they should. We used to, and in fact, Eisenhower, who set us on this path of ending the Soviet Union, really put in place a thinking about national security that should permeate all of our discussions with regard to defense. And in fact, one famous thing that he said upon his leaving office was, beware the undue influence of the military-industrial complex. So this is, in my mind, one of the key statements he made that supported the strategy that he had, which is, let's focus on deterrence. Let's build the economic prosperity of America. Let's make sure that Americans have the capacity to have a job, own a home, and make a better life for their kids. And over time, our system will beat all the other systems because it's the right system. What we've done instead is basically adopt into our midst, authoritarian regimes like China and Russia, gave them access to our society, our factories, our technology, but we've kept this nuclear enterprise, and it's been there. It's been protecting us. It's been preventing direct military conflict between a rising China, a more belligerent Russia, and the United States, even though we've basically discounted it in Washington, D.C. So, this is, I think, a huge topic. It ought to be at the, top level of what the Secretary of Defense thinks about. But I guarantee you, and I saw it when I was there, he's spending time thinking about Afghanistan, he's thinking about Iraq, he's thinking about the islands in the South China Sea, and the naval forces, and we don't have enough F-35s, and we need so many more brigade combat teams. And he's not thinking about the one thing that prevents us from having the 100 million casualties we had during World War II and the 30 to 40 million casualties we had during World War I. And so these two catastrophic wars really have, since the arrival of nuclear weapons, have been transformed the nature of warfare and the nature of casualties that you see in warfare because of this tendency for large belligerents that are nuclear armed not to go to direct military conflict because they're worried about the consequences of that. And so I think I support obviously the Strategic Deterrent Coalition. I support what you do. I think there's one other area. You mentioned the triad, and the triad, works together to ensure that any one leg can't, it works together to support a comprehensive deterrent effect. The ICBMs that exist in our heartland mean that any adversary would have to directly attack the American homeland to take them out. The subs are hidden. The bombers are a very visible show of force. So as we modernize that triad, it's important that we understand why we have a triad and the role that each leg of that triad plays. But there's a key component that you haven't talked about, and it's one that's near and dear to my heart because I think it's integrated with the overall challenges we face in the United States from a cyber perspective and from an EMP perspective, and that is nuclear command and control. And the fact that that's probably the oldest unwritten leg or unknown leg of the triad that is completely in the past. And today we have very little capability in terms of modernization. So talk a little bit about nuclear command and control, because that to me, I think is one of the key pieces of this overall puzzle.
Well, this gets back to my early point. We're really difficult to talk about something that's both complicated and heavily classified. The best explanation I've heard recently is NC3, nuclear command and control, is not a thing. It's a system of systems. And it is probably best defined is how we better communicate with each other. I think the way I understand it is one of the difficulties we've had in the fighter world is the F-22 couldn't talk to some of the other fighters. And they worked a whole lot of that. So it's the communications between the systems. Well, it becomes especially important in the nuclear enterprise when you're talking about the triad and you're talking about different weapons systems. You're talking about and different weapons and different platforms, and all of this to be coordinated so that the president has options in the event of a crisis. And all of that information needs to be pulled together in a really fast, succinct form in order to make an informed decision. So it's not quite like having a nuclear button, but it's like having all of the information so that all the options are on the table. And that's the way I would try to explain what NC3. Now, what have we done about that? With all of the work that's going on with the triad, the modernization with each leg of the triad, the prior secretary, one of the prior secretaries of defense, put the responsibility on the shoulders of U.S. Stratcom to handle this, to figure this out. And they're doing so. And from what I understand, they're making great progress. And that's pulling all the pieces together. And that's, I trust that's the way you look at it. That's what NC3 is, pulling the pieces together so that all the facts are in front of us, so that the National Command Authority has all of the options readily available when something needs to be done. So it's an extremely strong and important part of the whole modernization of the nuclear enterprise, because as new systems and weapons come on, there's more to be integrated than in the past. And as new systems and weapons come on that are managed, the systems are managed in a different way. It's kind of, we're converting from an analog information system to digital. That would be one way I would try to describe it. Does that make sense from a layman's explanation of NC3?
Well, I think the way that I would describe it is it's basically the system that allows the president to pick up the phone and have what he wants to have happen. Now, as you know, one of the ways that John Warden talked about warfare was thinking about the 5 rings, and going after the ability of the commander of a force to not communicate with forces is a key component of that strategy. And so in many respects, nuclear command and control becomes the most important part of the nuclear enterprise, because to the extent the president is cut off from communications with his forces, that would be a very, very bad day. I think that the other issue that's really not well understood by the American people is that nuclear command and control was the last and only system that was ever created to withstand a high altitude nuclear burst. And today, our world, our digital world, the world of smartphones, is not hardened against high altitude nuclear bursts. And I think this is an area where what is happening in nuclear command and control can inform how the rest of the United States, particularly on the public side, should think about infrastructure. In other words, if you could shut the lights out with one high altitude nuclear burst over the United States, you wouldn't necessarily harm anybody physically with a nuclear weapon, but you would shut out the lights, you'd turn off all the smartphones, and essentially in a matter of hours, we'd be like Katrina from west to east coast. And so I think about this quite a lot, particularly in the context of not so much Russia and China, but a rogue regime like North Korea or maybe Iran that could get a weapon, and one weapon could create enormous devastation in the United States because of the vulnerability and the requirement of our society to have these smartphones and everything, to do everything from banking to have medical treatment now because of telemedicine and everything. It's a vital part of our national security. And when we think about nuclear command and control, we're thinking about the hardening of those systems for that kind of attack, but that doesn't extend to the population. That doesn't mean that we're protecting the American people from shutting the lights out. Now, I wonder, what the president would say if his chief of staff walked in one day and said, "Mr. President, I have good news and bad news. The good news is you still have full control and command over all your nuclear forces. The bad news is no American cell phone will work, no lights will come on, no bank transfers are happening. The country, from a digital perspective, is shut down. Mr. President, what are your orders?" So, Joe, this has been a great conversation. I think the audience is going to love what you have to say. It's something that they don't get every day, and your commitment to the nation as a patriot is something that every American should applaud. Americans serve in many ways. They serve in uniform, they serve in businesses, and they serve as civic leaders like you have. And I want to thank you for your patriotism, for your support. Thank you for being on Generally Speaking.
Thank you, Rob. Great to see you.
Great to see you.